Yes, ma'am. Good
Am I
afternoon.
am good afternoon. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just a second. Let's start now then. Just a second. Okay. So I'll be taking you MEG 3, the paper in British novel, and the paper includes 9 blocks, each on a British novel. Block 1 is on Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, and Block 2, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Block 3 is on Charlotte Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Block 4, Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. In Block 5, you have George Eliot's Middlemarch. We have also Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Then we have James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a young man. Block 8 is E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. And Block 9 is Muriel Sparks' The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. So all these are classic texts of English literature and constitute an important part of the canon. A study of English novel and literature will remain incomplete without reading these authors and particularly these prescribed texts. Okay. So it's a nuanced selection from different periods of English literature and can be called representative text of their time. Okay. Let's begin with Fielding's Tom Jones. But before
Good
that,
afternoon, ma'am.
good afternoon.
Good afternoon, ma'am. This is Kireswara, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
So
Yes,
now this is MEG 3, ma'am. We have to start.
MEG3. Yes, MEG3.
Okay.
Please keep your yes microphones on silent mode or mute your
Okay.
microphones
Okay, ma'am.
so
Thank
that
you.
in the first part I'll deliver the lecture and in the last part we'll have interactions. Okay. So we were just starting and I told the names of the prescribed text for MEG3. Let's start now. So while discussing a literary text, it's important to know how to approach it or how to critically appreciate it. Okay. We don't read a literary text at students of literature for story only. We must know how to approach a text critically. So when we read a text or especially a novel, two things are important. It's very important. Be careful and listen. Yes. The first one is context and second text. So when we speak of context, it includes the social, cultural background of the period, or let's say historical background of the period. Then we also talk about the literary background of the period, then the author's biography and other works. So a work of art or literature cannot be appreciated if we do not know something about the background of the period, then the literary background of the period and the author's biography and other works, because the context always shapes the text. Okay. Next, coming to the text. Uh, let's begin. Let's tell me that I am going to structure my lecture in two parts. In the first part, we will talk about the context of Tom Jones, like the subparts will be like the social cultural background of 18th century because the novel was written in 18th century. Then we'll talk about the literary background with emphasis on prose because the 18th century is also called the age of prose and region. And we witnessed during the period the rise of novel as an art form or as a form or as a genre of literature. Then we'll talk about Henry Fielding, his biography and other works. Next, the second part will be on the text. We will begin with we'll begin with the characters. Who are the main characters in Tom Jones? Because we find a plethora of characters. So then the story, we'll summarize the story in brief. We know that it's a very fat book. of more than 800 or so, then pages or so. Then we will discuss the questions of previous years. After analyzing the questions, we will find that three things are important in a novel, okay, from examination point of view. First, the themes. Second, the characters. And third, narrative technique. So I repeat, you mostly get questions on themes, characters, and narrative techniques. So while analyzing the text, we will discuss the story, we'll discuss the questions of previous years, then we will have our discussion on themes, characters, and narrative techniques. Okay. We have one more important thing here, the critical approaches in which the feminist concern in Fielding. It is a part of your IGNOU material, so we are also going to discuss that. I'll not be very scholarly during this lecture, rather I would prefer to be pragmatic. So let's begin. Let's begin with the context. All of you can hear me? Am I clear and audible to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, Tom Jones was written in 1749, or it was published in 1749. So the novel belonged to the 18th century. The 18th century has been called the Augustan age also. We also call it the neoclassical age, the age of enlightenment, the age of prose and reason. So it has been variously named. Let's begin with the word Augustan. So now we are discussing the socio-cultural background of 18th century in which this particular book, Tom Jones, was written by Henry Fielding. So the term Augustan was derived from the name of illustrious Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar, whose reign marked the heyday, the glorious days of Roman literature, with three of the greatest writers, Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, living around this time. So in the 18th century England, the term was applied to describe the first half of 18th century English literature, when writers like Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, Dr. Johnson, Joseph Addison, and Richard Steele dominated the literary world, writing in the tradition of the great Romans. They openly admitted to admire and imitate these Roman classical masters. So it has been called the Augustan age. Next, we also call it neoclassical age. Neoclassical age. The far-reaching influence of the classical masters of Greece and Rome earned the phrase the neoclassical age for this period. The classical qualities imbibed, learned by the 18th century writers included symmetry, harmony, control, reason, R-E-A-S-O-N, reason is a key word, decorum, realism, and above all, an appeal to the intellect rather than the emotion. So the 18th century is marked by an appeal to the intellect rather than the emotion. They thrived on the conscious imitation of the literary forms and the rules of classical literature. And another parallel between the classical Roman age and the 18th century English one was the choice of heroic mode both in poetry and drama. So the neoclassical writers believed that literature should both instruct and delight, and that the proper subject of any art was humanity. And all these received great emphasis during this 18th century. That's why it has been called the neoclassical age. Let's move on to the word enlightenment. Enlightenment is a key word in 18th century. The English neoclassical period is frequently identified with the European Enlightenment. It did not occur only in England. It encompassed the whole of Europe, the rise and growth of the rational and scientific thought in Europe from the last years of the 17th century through the 18th. The identification arose because of the emphasis on the principle of rationality, order, and logic, which were key features of enlightenment. I repeat, rationality, order, and logic were the key features of the enlightenment. The insistence on rationalism led to the development of more organized and classified thought processes. And the 18th century thus became a highly productive period for dictionary, the encyclopedia, and other forms of systematic and organizing writing. Also, during this period emerged the periodical essay and also the novel as an art form. One most important development in the society of 18th century was the rise of city-based middle class. I repeat, the rise of city-based middle class, which ensured that the English culture was no longer in the hands of a tiny group of people like courtiers and landed aristocrats. It now became the property of a much larger and much diverse class of merchants, gentry, professional men. Then it also witnessed the two strong political parties. The period witnessed two strong political parties like the Whigs and the Tories. Then next we come to the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution. The newfound economic mentality was also fallout of the Industrial Revolution, which started in the early 18th century and continued till the middle of the 19th. And this great socio-economic movement began in England and gradually spread to Western Europe and America. It transformed England from a predominantly rural and agricultural country into a predominantly urban and manufacturing one.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
May I audible, ma'am?
Yes. Please tell.
You are teaching block 1, ma'am?
Yes.
You are teaching block 1.
Block 1. Okay. We are discussing block 1, which is on Tom Jones.
You are teaching block 1 or
Tom Jones.
Yes.
And I told in the beginning that we can't read a literary text in separation from its context.
Yes, which chapter, ma'am?
Listen, we are not reading any chapter. We are at the introduction.
Which chapter, ma'am?
We are at the introduction. Okay, I told you in the beginning that we are reading block 1, which is on Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. Am I clear? And I told in the beginning that a literary text cannot be read in separation from the context. So we are discussing the context now. The context of Tom Jones, the period in which it was written, the social cultural background of 18th century in which it was written, then the rise of novel as an art form, then the life and the works of Henry Fielding, then only we can come to the text. Okay. So we have to know the context to really understand a text.
Thank you.
Did you understand? Are you clear? That's why in the beginning I told you the way I have structured the whole lecture. So in the beginning we'll discuss the context. Now we are discussing the socio-cultural background of 18th century. And I told you that the 18th century is also called the Augustan age, the region, neoclassical age, enlightenment, the age of enlightenment. There was a great emphasis on region, R-E-A-S-O-N, logic, order. Then the period witnessed the rise of middle class, which is closely associated with the rise of novel as an art form. Then the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution transformed England from a predominantly rural and agricultural country into a predominantly urban and manufacturing one. So the 18th century was thus conducive in every way to the promotion of literary professionalism. So literary professionalism developed in 18th century. Writers no longer regarded their craft as gentle pastime or a flattery aimed at securing a generous patronage, but they wrote for money. So the spread of literacy, together with the emergence of commercial booksellers, publishers, and an ever-expanding reading public made writing a viable profession. So I'll summarize again in the context of 18th century, or when we discussed the socio-cultural background of 18th century, we discussed it is called the Augustan age, neoclassical age, the age of enlightenment. The age witnessed the rise of middle class, industrial revolution, and literary professionalism. Okay, against such background, writers like Fielding wrote. Clear? Let's move on to the next part, the literary background. I'm not going to discuss drama, poetry, and all that. We will focus on the rise of novel. We will focus just on the rise of novel as an art form which developed in the 18th century. So the scientific temperament and the emphasis on region, REASON, led to the focus of literature towards real life and real people. The medieval minds cleared and books and libraries prospered, and writings became both a profession and a trade. Let's discuss the word novel, the meaning. The English word novel derives from the Italian novella. It's taken from the Latin novella narratio, meaning a kind of story. The novella is usually uh, used to denote any fictional prose work, such as Boccaccio's Decameron. Okay. So though distinct from the novel, the novella is widely viewed as an influential forerunner. It is also the form on which English writers most often drew for their subject matter. And when we speak of the growth and development of novel as a genre in 18th century, it was not entirely a new genre that suddenly sprang up at the end of 17th century or in the beginning of 18th century. We also talk about the accounts of travels. Go back to the travels of Sir Mandeville, which was probably published in 1375. When we speak of the rise of novel, we also speak of medieval prose romances like Thomas Malory's 15th century Morte d'Arthur. A significant growth in novel is also marked in Sir Thomas More's Utopia in 1516. It was influential in fictionalizing travel and thus providing an impetus to the growth of the novel. Next, we can mention Thomas Naas, The Unfortunate Traveler, 1594, which was one of the earliest picture tales in English, which anticipated the picaresque heroes and the heroines of Daniel Defoe and Henry Fielding. Then in the rise of novel, a significant text is Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, which is an allegorical Puritan narrative. So Bunyan's brilliant narrative style inspired the writing of Aphra Behn and Defoe. So of all these novelist prototypes, advanced as the first novel in European literature, Cervantes' Don Quixote. When we speak of the rise of novel, as the predecessor of the novel, we mostly give credit to Cervantes' Don Quixote. So all the pioneering English novelists of the early 18th century had learned key lessons from their European predecessors. From all these works, all these texts I just mentioned, like let me sum up the forerunners of the novel: Boccaccio's Decameron, Travels of John Mandeville, Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, Thomas More's Utopia, Thomas Naas, The Unfortunate Traveler, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and Cervantes' Don Quixote. Then when we come to 18th century, the chief founders of the genre were Defoe, Daniel Defoe, who is famous for the book Robinson Crusoe, or for Jonathan Swift and his Gulliver Travels. There are several other books, but these books are identified with the authors. Then when we speak of Samuel Richardson, we speak of Pamela, Clarissa. Then Henry Fielding's Tom Jones and other books. Then we also speak of Smollett and Sterne. When we speak of Lawrence Sterne, we speak of Tristram Shandy, which is credited as the first psychological novel or the stream of consciousness we find in that particular book. So the major names in novel in 18th century are Defoe, Swift, Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, and Sterne. Among these writers, especially Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, and Sterne has been called the four wheels of novel van. So this is something about the rise of novel in 18th century, which was influenced by other writings. And we just discussed the predecessors of the novels. Okay, so we discussed some basic issues here, which will help you to understand not just Tom Jones, but also the development of novel in 18th century. Okay. Then the evolution of, when we speak of the evolution of novel, earlier prose had seldom been a medium of serious creative endeavor before 18th century. Barring a few exceptions, writers of the past chose verse, longer poems, poetic drama, short poems to share their views, experience, and vision with the audience. And this is how it has to be seen. The audience consisted of the selected few. Then what led to the emergence and popularity of the novel? That we have to understand. Because Tom Jones was written in 18th century, and this century marked the rise of the novel. So it's very important to know what led to the emergence and popularity of the novel in 18th century. Okay. So we have to think about the factors which inspire a writer to choose a particular form from the already existing forms in the 18th century. First one is the presence of middle class women. A whole lot of them in the 18th century society had the leisure to relax at home with a book or a periodical in hand, as well as the inclination to know how to dress, how to work, converse, also to contemplate upon the questions of right and wrong in life. They were no ordinary women. So the presence of middle class women is the first factor, and second is the rise of periodical. You must have heard about Edition Steele, Dr. Johnson. You must have heard about the Tatler, the Spectator. And you will be surprised to find that even women, they wrote periodicals. So we have things like the Lady Spectator, the Lady Tattlers. See, you are the student of English literature now and you are doing your MA. The students of MA just can't read a text and its summary. They have to read it elaborately. They have to read the context, the background, the writer, his other works, then the text. This is how we read literature. It's not like other subjects. See, in literature, we read and we enjoy it. It does not require hard labor like other subjects. We read for pleasure. Okay. Then the novelist comedy developed in 18th century. The comedy in the 18th century differed immensely from that of 17th century. It became lighter in vein and dealt with those issues which could be easily resolved. Take the case of social manner, under whose overall perspective questions such as marriage and love were considered by the writers. And the relationship of love became extremely important in social discourse, which great emphasis was laid on individual choice as opposed to being social and political events of earlier times. So the focus on social manner, only those who have solved the problems of bread and butter think of evolving a code of behavior like the middle class. The issues of virtue, goodness, morality, kindness, all these were explored in novels. Then let's come to Henry Fielding. Against such background, Henry Fielding wrote. So Fielding turned to writing novels after a prolific career as a dramatist. He tried his hand at parody by writing an apology for the life of Mrs. Pamela Andrews. Can you tell me what was it? Was it a retaliation to any other book? this apology for the life of Sharmila Andrews. I hope there are students who are from English literature. Sharmila rhymes with Pamela. So it was a answer or retaliation to Richardson's Pamela, which the book made the innocent virtue of Richardson's heroine appear as wickedness. This work was followed by his first novel, Joseph Andrew, in which the central character, Joseph Andrews, was presented as Pamela's brother. So the two books were answers to Richardson. Then Fielding's next work, Miscellanies, included the life of Jonathan Wild the Great. Then Fielding's next literary achievement, The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling. This book was the most successful comic novels ever written. It is prescribed in the PG syllabus of almost all the universities. And Tom is the young foundling who enjoys his freedom to travel and to enjoy sensual experiences until his true origins are discovered. When he matures, he accepts his social responsibilities and he marries the woman who has faithfully waited for him. In Tom Jones, Fielding traces the picaresque journey from innocence to experience. We will discuss what is that picaresque tradition. Then it's a rambling tale of adventure and intrigue, and it has 200 chapters. It's a long book. The rapid changes of scene and the vast area of minor characters. There are so many characters in Tom Jones, it will be hard to remember. So it's better to note all the characters. They are essential to the lively comic style of the novel. Then we also, the novel caused a huge uproar after its publication. But for the modern context, the amorous adventures of Tom Jones are merely wonderfully entertaining. At that time, in 18th century, when it was published, the hero who had numerous amorous adventures was not considered morally good. But now it is considered wonderfully entertaining. Then Fielding's last novel, Amelia. Amelia was less exuberant and reflected his own grim experience of social hardship in the metropolis. His last work was The Journal of a Voyage to Lisbon. It was the chief interest, was chiefly of interest as an indirect self-portrait of the author. So as a novelist, we see that Fielding was a committed critic of the contemporary society's corruptions and hypocrisies, which he presented in a comic vein. Just the names you need to remember, the books he wrote. But let's come directly to Tom Jones. I'll tell in the beginning about the characters. Who are the characters? Okay, who are the characters? Then we'll tell the story. I'll tell the story so that you will remember the story. Because last year I took the classes and the students wanted me to tell the stories. Because in IGNOU material, we don't find the story. It is a much improved, a much higher version of that material, means of the story kind of materials. We find critical analysis. You have been provided the best of materials. You need to read the novel, which is available on the net. Okay. And during this COVID-19 situation, many scholarly journals, okay, many sites, they are providing scholarly journals free of cost. As students of literature, two sites will be of worth to you. One is Gestor, I repeat, and second is Project Muse, especially Project Muse. Those who want to do better in the exams and want to read or who can appreciate critically rich materials, they can visit Project Muse and search articles on these topics. They are available freely. You can have scholarly materials from Project Muse. See, at this point, I would just like to divert a little and tell you that at PG stage, you should not go for things like Wikipedia. Now the internet is overflowing with information. Everybody has access to information. You can have a lot of information on anything from the internet. But the real thing is the matter of choice. You have to choose authentic materials. Everything available on the net is not authentic. You have to go for authentic material. Okay. And when we speak of articles, journal articles, it's better to trust the site Project used for journal articles in literature. So let's begin with the characters of Tom Jones. Tom Jones is the central character, the protagonist of the piece of the novel, and he is an illegitimate child, and he was found by Squire Allworthy. Then Sophia Weston is the heroine of the novel. She is Weston's only daughter. Okay. Then we have Master William Bleefield. He's the son of Captain Bleefield and Brigade. Brigade is the sister of Squire Walworthy. Squire Walworthy is the wealthy squire of an estate in Somerset, and the story begins in Somersetshire. It's the setting for Tom Jones. In the beginning, the first part is set in Somersetshire. So Squire Allworthy is Tom's guardian or Tom Jones' guardian. Then Squire Weston is the father of Sophia, the heroine. Miss Brigade Allworthy is Allworthy's sister, who later becomes Mrs. Bleefield and gave birth to a boy, Bleefield, who is the rival to Tom Jones. Then we have Lady Bellaston, a fashionable lady in London, Mrs. Honor Blackmore, Dr. Bleefield. Dr. Bleefield and Captain Bleefield, they visited the house of this Allworthy. And Dr. Bleefield is Captain Bleefield's brother. He dies of a broken heart because of his brother's rejection. After being married to Bridget, Captain Bleefield disowned his brother. Then Captain Bleefield, who married Brigade Allworthy, the lawyer Dolly, a lawyer, Lord Fallamore, Fitzpatrick, Harriet Fitzpatrick. We have a character called Jenny Jones, who is earlier believed to be the mother of Tom Jones. Okay, that's why the title Jones, Jenny Jones. He was believed to be the son of Jenny Jones, and she later became Mrs. Waters. Then we have Mrs. Millers, her daughters, Nancy and Betty Millers. Then Mr. Nightingale, a young gentleman of leisure whom Tom met on the way. Then Mr. Benjamin Pettridge, a teacher who was believed to be the father or who was suspected to be the father of Tom Jones. Then Mrs. Pettridge, then Mr. Black George, then Miss Molly Segreen, and this Molly was the daughter of this Black Church, and she was Tom Jones' first lover. Then Mr. Thomas Square, we have Miss Weston, Mrs. Wilkins, a number of characters, but the chief characters are Tom Jones, his master or his patrons, Mr. Allworthy, his sister Brigade Allworthy, who is married to Captain Bleefield. Captain Bleefield and Brigade Allworthy, their son is Mr. Bleefield, who is the rival of Tom Jones. This is about the Allworthy family. Then Squire Weston, Mrs. Weston is the sister of Squire Weston. Then Sophia is the daughter of Squire Weston. These are the central characters you need to remember. And in the beginning, we find that that Pettridge is a teacher, and he was believed to be the father, or he was suspected to be the father of Tom Jones, and this Jenny Jones was believed to be the mother of Tom Jones, but they were not. Against these characters or this background, let's read the summary of the text. Okay, it's a very long story, so we can't go chapter by chapter. It's better to have a summary of the whole story. so that when we will have critical analysis of the themes, the characters, and the narrative techniques, you will be able to understand. So there is always a difference between the first and the second readings of a text. The first brings a kind of initiation into the work, and the second brings us closer to a number of hidden features of the work. When we first read it, we read it for the story. When we read it for the second time, we are able to critically appreciate it. For example, while exploring the relationship, the characters, the events in Tom Jones, we get a glimpse of the social structure that prevailed in England in the middle of 18th century. The novel gives a panorama of views, of characters, and in the process, we get a glimpse of the 18th century society. Then Tom Jones, like its predecessor, Joseph Andrews, is constructed around a romance plot. It has a romance plot. Squire Allworthy suspects that the infant whom he adopts and names Tom Jones is the illegitimate child of his servant, Jenny Jones. Okay, I'll be slow so that you can remember the story. When Tom is a young man, he falls in love with Sophia Weston, his beautiful and virtuous neighbor, the daughter of Squire Weston. In the end, his true identity is revealed and he wins Sophia's hand. Earlier, he was believed to be an illegitimate child. Later, it was revealed that he was the son of Brigade Allworthy, or Allworthy's sister. Okay. And in the course of the action, the various sets of characters pursue each other from one part of the country to another, giving Fielding an opportunity to paint an incomparably vivid picture of England in the mid-18th century. As I told you earlier, it's a long novel. The novel's events occupy 18 books. The novel has been given the title Tom Jones. Okay. So at the obvious level, the book is the story of Tom Jones, isn't it? Okay, so it's a story of Tom's life from the time he was born till the time he married Sophia. Let us take a glance at some of the important points raised through the depiction of Tom's life. The book opens with the narrator stating that the purpose of the novel will be to explore human nature. In the beginning, Fielding says that the purpose of his book is to explore human nature. We can divide Tom's adventure in the book in three parts. First, Tom at Somersetshire, the place which belonged to Allworthy. Then second, his travel. His stopping at the inns and various places. And third is his life at London. Okay, we can divide it into three parts. Let's begin with the story. The distinguished country gentleman Allworthy, who lives in Somersetshire with his unmarried sister Brigade Allworthy, arrives home from a trip to London and he discovered a baby boy in his bed. Allworthy undertakes to uncover the mother and father of this foundling. See, the title of the story is Tom Jones, the History of a Foundling. Okay, he was a foundling. And Allworthy suspects the local woman, Jenny Jones, and a teacher, Mr. Fretties, guilty of this illegitimate child. Means he believed them to be the parents of that child. Allworthy sent Jenny away from the countryside, from that area, and the poverty-stricken Fretties leaves of his own accord. In spite of the criticism of the parish, the priest, okay, the church, Allworthy decides to bring up the boy. Soon after, Brigade marries Captain Blifil, a visitor at Allworthy's estate, and she gives birth to a son of her own, and the son is named Blifil. So Captain Blifil regards Tom Jones with jealousy, and since he wishes his son to inherit all of Allworthy's possessions, because Allworthy was a rich man. And deliberately, Blifil had married Brigade because of the money. So while meditating on money matters, Captain Blifil falls dead of an apoplexy. Suddenly he died. After that, the story is skipped for 12 years. Okay, the narrator skips forward 12 years. After 12 years, we find Blifil and Tom Jones have been brought up together in the house of Allworthy. But they receive vastly different treatment from other members of the family, from the household, of the household. Allworthy is the only person who shows consistent affection for Tom. And Allworthy is a nice person. Okay, don't press the present button, please. Okay. Manas Das, don't press that present button. Yes, let's continue. So they were Blifil and Tom Jones were brought up together in Allworthy's house. And Allworthy is the only person who shows consistent affection for Tom. The philosopher Square and the Reverend Thwackum were the boys' tutor, and both were, though they were teachers or philosopher and Reverend meant priest, they despised Tom and adored Blifil. Since Tom is wild and Blifil seems to be pious, he seems to be very gentle and pious. Tom frequently steals apples, dogs to support the family of Black Judge. Black Judge. That person, one of Allworthy's servants. Black Judge was one of Allworthy's servants. Tom tells all of his secrets to Blifil, who then relates those to Thwackum or Allworthy and thereby getting Tom into trouble. So, Blifil always wanted Tom to be in trouble, though outwardly he seems to be very pure and pious kind of fellow. The people of the Paris, hearing of Paris means the church in the countryside, Tom's generosity to Black Church began to speak kindly of Tom while they condemned Blifil for his art. So gradually people saw that Tom was involved in stealing apples and dogs because he wanted to help Black Judge. Tom spent much time with Square Weston, Allworthy's neighbor. Since the Square is impressed by Tom's sportsmanship, and this Weston is father to Sophia Weston, the heroine. So Sophia Weston, Square Weston's only daughter, falls deeply in love with Tom. And Tom has already bestowed his affection on Molly. Molly is the daughter of that servant, Black Judge, the poor daughter of Black Judge. When Molly becomes pregnant, Tom prevents Allworthy from sending Molly to prison by admitting that he has fathered her child. Tom felt guilty and he acknowledged that he is the father of the child Molly is bearing. Tom, at first oblivious to Sophia's charms and beauty, falls deeply in love with her. After that, he fell in love with Sophia and begins to resent his ties to Molly. Still, he had to remain faithful because Molly was with a child. And Tom's commitment to Molly ends when he discovers that she had multiple affairs with various persons, which means that Tom is not the father of her child, and it frees him to confess his feelings to Sophia. After that, there was no need to feel guilty because of Molly, and Tom freely confessed his feelings to Sophia. So Tom and Sophia are a pair. Allworthy falls gravely ill at that time, and he summons his family and friends to be near him. He was a rich man, so he reads out his will, and everybody expected to inherit something from him. He states that Blifil will inherit most of his estate. Blifil, who was the son of his sister, will inherit most of the estate, though Tom is only provided for. He was not given much property. And Thwackum and Square, those two teachers of these boys, they were upset because they were promised only £1,000, each of them. Then Tom experiences great emotion at Allworthy's illness, and he barely leaves his bedside. He was very attached to him. A lawyer named Dowling arrives and suddenly announced that Brigadier Allworthy is dead. Okay. He announced the death of Brigadier Allworthy, who was the mother of Blifil. When the doctor announced that Allworthy will not die, Allworthy started to recover, and Tom rejoiced. Tom was very happy, and happily he got drunk on both joy and alcohol. So Blifil calls Tom a bastard, and Tom retaliates by hitting him. Tom, after swearing eternal constancy to Sophia, again he encounters Molly by chance and makes love to her. Yes, so he was engaged in a number of amorous adventure. Who? Tom Jones. Then Mrs. Weston, the aunt of Sophia. Sophia spent much of her youth with the aunt. She comes to stay with her brother's house, at her brother's house, and she and Square fight constantly, but they were united over one thing. That was their plan to marry Sophia to Blifil, because Blifil was the legitimate heir to the property of Osworthy. That's why they wanted Blifil to be their son-in-law. Mrs. Weston promises not to reveal Sophia's love for Tom as long as Sophia submits to receiving Blifil as a suitor. And Blifil thus begins his courtship of Sophia. And Allworthy also believes that Sophia must love Blifil. So they wanted, means the society, they wanted Sophia to marry Blifil because they were equal in position, status. Sophia, however, strongly opposed the proposal, and Square Weston grows violent with her. He was a typical patriarch. Blifil tells Osworthy that Tom is a rascal, and he drank in the house, and Osworthy, he created a bad impression of Tom in the mind of Allworthy. And Allworthy finally banishes Tom from the country. Tom does not want to leave Sophia, so he decides that he must follow the honorable path. Then we find Tom on the road. Tom Jones travel. Tom begins to wander about the countryside. In Bristol, he happens to meet up with Pettis, that schoolmaster, who becomes his loyal servant. Tom also rescues Mrs. Water, that Jenny Jones, from being robbed, and they begin an affair at a local inn. Sophia, who ran away from the family, from her house, to avoid marrying Blifil, she stops at the inn and discovers that Tom is having an affair with Mrs. Waters. That Jenny Jones has become Mrs. Waters now. She leaves off her muff, M-U-F-F. She leaves her muff, and muff is a kind of symbol here in Tom's bed, so that he knows that he has been there, she has been there. And when Tom finds the muff, he frantically sets out in pursuit of Sophia. Then we find the Irishman Fitzpatrick arrives at the inn. There are a number of people who goes to the inn. And Fitzpatrick goes there to search for his wife, and Mr. Weston arrives searching for Sophia. Then we find Tom in London. Tom in London. On the way to London, Sophia rides with her cousin Harriet. And this Harriet is Fitzpatrick's wife. You have to remember these characters. So many characters are there. So Fitzpatrick's wife Harriet is the cousin of Sophia, and she accompanies Sophia.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
I am not getting about the character. There are two very much character are there.
Yes.
So I am not getting anything, ma'am. I am not getting anything. Who are doing what and who is?
That's why you have to come prepared. At least before the class, you have to go through the story so that you will understand it. Because all the texts prescribed for you are big text, fat text, and all the text, all the novels which have been prescribed for you, they have a lot of characters. Lot of characters.
Who did what? Who did what? I am not getting anything.
That's why I told in the beginning the number of characters. I mentioned some of the prominent characters in the beginning. I'll repeat for you in case many of the students they missed it. Okay. So Allworthy is a character. a square, a
Yes.
rich man
Yes.
who found Tom Jones. Okay. Tom Jones was an
Okay.
illegitimate child who was found on the bed of Allworthy. Okay. And in Allworthy's
Okay.
home, we found another character, Brigade Allworthy, who was the sister of this square Allworthy. Okay. Then Brigade Allworthy is married to Blifil, Captain Blifil. Captain Blifil came because of the money. He wanted to marry this Brigade Allworthy, and they are married. And their son is Blifil. So Tom Jones and this boy Blifil, they are contemporaries of the same age. They are raised together in the house of Allworthy. Got it? And they are rival to each other. Blifil seemed to be a very well-behaved, a pious kind of boy, though he was not. But on the surface, overtly, Tom seems to be very unruly. But he was very good at heart. He always wanted to help others. For example, that person uh, who was staying uh, Black Judge, who was a servant of Allworthy. Black Judge was a poor person. So Tom used to steal things and give it to this Black Judge. And Black Judge had a daughter, Molly. And Tom had an affair with that Molly. Okay. In the meantime, Molly became pregnant. Then let's go to another house, the house of Weston, Square Weston. Square Weston and his sister, Mrs. Weston. Sophia is the daughter of Square Weston. I repeat, Sophia, the heroine of the story, is the daughter of Weston. Okay. So Tom used to visit Square Weston and Sophia fell in love with Tom Jones. But Tom Jones could not acknowledge his feelings to Sophia because he was involved with Molly and he believed that Molly was bearing his child. Later he discovered that Molly had affairs with several men. So Tom Jones found that the child was not his child. So he confessed his love for Sophia. Is it clear? Yes, is it clear?
Clear, man.
Okay. Then the family. Okay, we talked about the social background of the period and all that. It still persists in the present period. People marry or people they try to find match of the same status. We know that Tom Jones was a foundling, was an illegitimate child. So naturally, Sophia's parent or Square Weston and even the aunt of Sophia, Mrs. Weston, they wanted Sophia to be married to Blifil because Blifil belonged to a rich family, Allworthy. He was a legitimate child of Brigade and Captain Blifil. So they wanted Sophia to marry Blifil. Even Allworthy believed that they should be married. Okay. In the meantime, Allworthy fell ill. And we are also reported that Brigade Allworthy, the mother of Blifil, is dead. Then Blifil had some quarrel with Tom and he was sent out of the house. Who? Tom. Then we find Tom on the road. Tom Jones travels. He stays at certain inns, INN. He stays there. We found there he had amorous adventures. He slept with women. He met people. That is usual thing we find in most of the stories of the time. So during this visit, uh, he stopped at an inn and he had an affair with Mrs. Water, that Jenny Jones. And in the story, we find that Allworthy thought that Jenny Jones was the mother of Tom Jones. Okay. Though she was not. That is another story. So Tom had an affair with that Mrs. and that Jenny Jones had become Mrs. Water. She was married and now she is Mrs. Water. And Sophia stopped at the same inn. The heroine, Sophia, stopped at the same inn and she found it out. So she left her muff to give the muff, muffler, to give Tom the message that she was there. After finding the mob, uh, Tom started again to find Sophia. Then finally we find Tom in London. London. Sophia was also in London with her cousin Harriet, and she had a rich relative there, Lady Belastone. Sophia's relative, Lady Belastone. And Lady Belastone was typical of the rich, urban, uh, middle-aged women. She was not a good person, and she wanted to have an affair with Tom Jones, who was much younger to her. So Tom and Patrice, that schoolmaster has now become the trusted companion of Tom Jones. Both were together. They stayed in the house of Mrs. Millers and all that, a long story that let's leave it. Let's not confuse you with that. Okay, you can go through it. You can find the summary from the internet. Then there we find that Sophia and Tom met at the house of this Lady Belastone. And we know that Tom now was having an affair, a relationship with this Lady Belastone. But once he was reconciled with Sophia, he wanted to break up the relationship with Lady Belastone. And he sent her a message giving her a marriage proposal. And she was scared. So naturally, Lady Belastone left Tom Jones. Still, she was determined not to allow Sophia with Tom Jones. So she encouraged another person, Lord Fellamar, Lady Belastone, who was a relative of Sophia living in London. And the same lady developed a relation with Tom Jones, who was much younger to her. She did not want Sophia to be involved with Tom Jones. So she encouraged another person, Lord Fellamar. She encouraged that person to rape Sophia. After all this, soon after we find that Square Weston, Mrs. Weston, Bleafield, Allworthy, all the persons, they arrive in London. And so Square Weston locked Sophia in her bedroom. Then after some time, the story is revealed, and Mrs. Water also reveals that Tom's mother was Brigade Allworthy. He was not the illegitimate child of Jenny Jones, rather he was the illegitimate child of Brigade Allworthy. So he was a half brother to Bleafield. So Tom Jones originally belonged to the family of Allworthy. Then the Square sent Allworthy a letter explaining that Tom's conduct during Allworthy's illness was honorable. He was full of compassion for Allworthy. So after the climax, we find the resolution, the falling action here, and the resolution of everything. Tom was sent to jail because he had a duel with Fitzpatrick at an inn. Finally, he was released and all the doubts are clear. Okay. I am not going into the details of those. So now Tom is Allworthy's heir. Square Weston is eager to encourage the marriage between Tom and Sophia when he found that he was not a foundling, rather he was the heir, the successor of Allworthy. So social position matters in marriage. And Sophia chastises Tom for his lack of chastity because he was often involved in amorous adventure with many women. But she agrees to marry him. And they live happily on Weston's estate with 2 children. And shower everyone around them with kindness and generosity. So the story has a happy ending with Sophia and Tom marrying each other. So here, though we find realism, we find mostly the comic approach of the author, Henry Fielding. I hope you got the story. To be very brief, it's the story of Sophia and Tom Jones. Bleafield is the antagonist or the villain, and the House of Weston, the Sophia is the daughter, the House of Allworthy, Tom and Bleafield are the sons. This is the story. And when Tom is on the road, we find a lot of character gets into the story, and you have to remember that. And I told you in the beginning that I have to be pragmatic because I know that you have chosen English PG, but most of the students are from different backgrounds. So I will not be very scholarly, rather I will be pragmatic, I told you. So let's discuss the questions of the previous years to understand how to approach this particular text with the IGNOU material. So first, you have to read 18th century social and literary background from a book on history of English literature, one. Second, you have to read The Rise of Novel. You can refer to the book by Ian Watt, IANWATT, Ian Watt, The Rise of Novel. Then third, you have to read the biography of the author. Who is the author? Henry Fielding. Okay. So you have to read about the life of Henry Fielding and his works. Next, you have to read the story, the summary, a detailed summary of the whole story. First read the characters, then read the story so that you will remember the story. And you can find the relationships, or you can connect the relationship of different characters to different characters. Let's come to the previous year's questions then. I had listed some of the questions from 2011 onwards till 2019. So the questions, I'm reading out the questions, okay, because we have time. So Fielding is not as sympathetic towards women as he is towards men, is a question. Discuss. Then discuss major themes in Tom Jones. Next, what attitude towards marriage does Fielding illustrate in Tom Jones? So themes, attitude towards marriage. Another theme, examine the importance of the narrator. Narrative technique. What do you understand by typical and individual character? Typical and individual characters, elucidated with reference to Tom Jones. Then Tom Jones is the story of a man's journey from innocence through experience to wisdom. Which events from the text best illustrate this? So the story, the development of the hero, Tom Jones' character, and his character development. It's the question on that. The next question is discuss Tom's relationship with Squire Weston and his family. Another question is comment on the significance of Men of the Hill episode in the novel Tom Jones. There is an episode there, Men of the Hill. Men of the Hill is a person whom Tom encounters on the road. Okay, and the person tells his whole story from his birth till that time. Okay, and we find the story is not related to the whole plot. It's a kind of digression we find. But when we reread the story, we find many similarities with the story of Tom Jones. So we can relate. So what's the significance of the Men of Hill episode in the novel Tom Jones? And this matter has been dealt with in the IGNOU material. You can find the answer in the IGNOU material. Then the next question, the ultimate task of Fielding's Tom Jones is to unite lovers without any critique on the social orders. Do you agree? This is on the social background and its treatment in the novel. Next, write a note on female representation in the novel Tom Jones. We have different types of female representation belonging to different classes and with different views also. Different temperament, different characters. Females from the high class, from the low class have been brought together and they have been given different treatments. Their views on chastity, morality are different. So you have to write a note on the female characters here. Not only Sophia, but Molly and others. How does Fielding realistically mirror the 18th century society in Tom Jones? Some more questions are which are from the previous year questions. How does the novel Tom Jones represent men? Then discuss the relationship between Tom and Sophia in the novel Tom Jones. Then the view about marriage. Another question is on marriage. In Tom Jones, does Fielding see marriage as a socio-economic alliance? Elucidate. and discuss how Tom Jones is a novel about the division of life in segments. And the June 19, the question was, discuss the feminist concern in Tom Jones. The reason I read all the questions of the previous year is that when we analyze these questions, we find out that mostly you get questions on three things. As I told you in the beginning, you get questions on themes, characters, and narrative techniques. You may not get a question directly that write a note on the themes of Tom Jones. Instead, a theme may be mentioned and you may be asked to discuss on that. Or, for example, on character. You may get a question on the central character, like sketch the character of Tom Jones, or the character development of Tom Jones, or maybe on Sophia. Did you get me? Or you may be asked to write a note on the minor characters, all in general the female characters. So mostly we get questions on themes, characters, and narrative techniques when we discuss a novel in particular. So let's begin with the themes. I'll try to complete this in half an hour, then we can have an open discussion on the novel. So on theme, the main theme of the novel is the contrast between Tom Jones' good nature and Bleefield's hypocrisy. Virtue versus vices. Then the secondary themes include several other examples of virtue like that of Squire Allworthy, or hypocrisy like that of Thwackum, or villainy like that of Mrs. Weston, or sometimes the villainy tempered by repentance, for example, like that of Mrs. Waters. And we find the introductory chapters. In each book, we find an introductory chapter. And we also find commentary by the narrator. And they introduce a long line of further themes. For example, the introductory chapters dwell extensively on bad writers and critics, quite all related to the plot, but apologetic to the author and the novel itself. Then we find authorial commentary on several characters. And we also find comment on the social events of the time, like Methodism, which was a religious movement. We also find that the novel took place against the backdrop of the Jacobite Rising of 1745. We find references to those historical events. So we find themes religious, ethical, moral, even socio-historical development in the novel. Then if you categorize it point-wise, then we can write things like virtue as action rather than thought. And this is elucidated in the character of Tom Jones. Fielding contrasts the concept of virtue espoused by characters like Squire Thwackum with the virtue actually practiced by Jones and Allworthy. Tom Jones and Allworthy. Tom is the active hero who saves damsel in distress and plans on fighting for his country. Is the embodiment of the very active type of virtue that Fielding esteems or respects. Then another theme is the impossibility of stereotypical categorization. Fielding cannot decide whether the novel is a philosophical history or a romance or an epic, comic, prosaic poem, because the title shows that it's a history of a foundling, whether it is a history novel or a romance, or even it is a mock heroic prose. So Fielding shortly suggests that cataloging fiction is silly, and he says that he would rather think of himself as the founder of a new province of writing. And this new province of writing is novel. Then we also find the tension between art and artifice. The method of narration is a central theme, as I told you of the introductory chapters. In all these 16 books, we find introductory chapters, which are full of commentaries and Fielding's view about art and artifice. That is also one theme. Next, character. Okay, you can find, because it's a very big fat book with so many things, you can find more things. Okay, because you will get questions of 20 marks. So you have to really write a long answer. Okay. And for that, we should prepare before the exams. You can have a master kind of notes on themes of 10 or 15 pages. And if you get, or if you find a particular topic, you can pick and write. Then characters. As I told you, you can find questions like sketch the character of the hero like Tom Jones or the protagonist or the heroine Sophia Weston. You can also find questions on female characters or the minor characters. But one thing is important, there was a question on typical and individual character. When you go to Unit 4 of IGNOU material, that particular book is on characters or characterization. There you find a discussion on the typical and individual characters, and it was a question. Typical and individual characters. Just a second. So what is typical character? The two concepts of the typical and individual can be gainfully employed to understand Fielding's characterization. Typicality stands for broader traits of a person's behavior. For example, the clergyman, as a member of the profession, or a maid servant, would behave in a certain way. And the society largely molds and shapes the behavior of its member. So the men and women living at the time bear the stamp of their society and its ways. While representing characters in this way, the writer implies that there is not much need to explore deep urges and the desires of such people. They are just presented as part of their profession. So there is no need to go into the deeper minds of those characters. They are typical characters, typical of their profession. A clergyman would behave in a certain way, or a maid would behave in a certain way, like that. So they differ too much by the gender. There is no need to go into the specificity of these characters. That is typical character. We have plenty of them in Tom Jones among the minor characters. Then the individual character. Individual in a character, it denotes that sensuousness which draws the reader close to the character. It establishes an imaginative link between the two, the reader and the character. They become one. And the authors achieve it through the psychological projection of character, in which not just the decisions taken, but the process through which the particular person reached the decision is communicated to the reader. So we get a glimpse into the mind of these characters, individual character, like Tom Jones, for example. We get into he not only acts, we also get into the mind of Tom Jones. So we can divide the characters of Fielding's Tom Jones into typical and individual characters. When you write the character of Tom Jones, you have to write about the different traits of his personality, the qualities. So Tom Jones, though he is an illegitimate child, he was raised by Allworthy, we know, and he is the hero, the eponymous hero or the protagonist of the book. In fact, the novel has been named after him. So about his qualities, we know that he had a good heart and his generosity makes him virtuous. He had a handsome face and his gallantry wins him the love and affection of women throughout the countryside. Everybody is attracted towards him. And his dignified though natural air induces characters to assume that he is a gentleman. And it ultimately comes to be true. He is not a bastard, he is a gentleman. He is the son of Brigade Allworthy, who is the sister of Allworthy, Squire Allworthy. Then you have to talk about the character of Sophia Weston. Sophia Weston is Fielding's beautiful, generous heroine and the daughter of Val and Squire Weston, who is a typical patriarch. Like Tom, Sophia lavishes gifts on the poor and she treats people of all classes with respect. So one landlady cannot believe that she is a gentlewoman, because gentlewomen are usually with air. Then Sophia manages to reconcile her love for Tom, her filial duty for her father, and her hatred for Blifil, to her courage and patience. And Sophia's natural courtesy can be contrasted with her Aunt Weston's artificial manners. Though she belonged to the gentry class, she did not believe in artificial manners, in contrast to that Lady Belladonna or Mrs. Weston. Then we have numerous other characters like Mr. Allworthy, Master Blifil. Master Blifil can be the villain of the story. Blifil is the antagonist to Tom Jones, and he's also the son of Brigadier Allworthy, and he's a half brother to Tom Jones. Then we have Squire Weston, who is Sophia's father. Mrs. Weston is the aunt of Sophia. Then Petrys is a schoolmaster who initially Allworthy thought that he was the father of Tom Jones. But later he became a trustworthy servant, a loyal servant to Jones, and he accompanied him when Tom was on the road. Then Jenny Jones later became Mrs. Waters, and she was suspected to be the mother of Tom Jones in the beginning, though she was not. Later at an inn, Tom Jones developed a relation, had an affair with her. Okay, and he felt guilty because he thought that she was his mother. Later it came out that she was not. And Brigadier Allworthy is the sister of Allworthy, who was the real mother of Tom Jones. She was also the mother of Blifil. Then Lady Belladonna, that artificial London lady who was a relative of Sophia, and she also developed a relation, an affair with Tom Jones. And when there was a reconciliation between Sophia and Tom Jones, knowingly Tom Jones sent her a marriage proposal to Lady Belladonna, and she is scared of it. Then we have Fitzpatrick. Harriet Fitzpatrick is a cousin of Sophia, and Mr. Fitzpatrick is the husband of this Harriet. They are also part of the narrative of the story. Then Mr. Dowling is a lawyer. We have many other characters like Black Judge, a servant in Allworthy's home, and his daughter Molly, who had an affair with Tom Jones, and she was pregnant, and Tom believed that the child was his. Later he found that she had multiple affairs, and he was relieved. He did not find himself guilty, and he was free. He was free to confess his love for Sophia. And we find the narrator is fielding himself. In Tom Jones, there is no, it's a third person narration, and we have several point of views. So go into the details of the characters from Unit 4 of IGNOU material. Then in Unit 5, you will find about narrative technique. IGNOU material, Unit 5, it's on narrative technique. The title is Artistic Unity or Socio-Cultural Concern. Which one is important? When we talk of this Tom Jones, we have to talk of Bildungsroman and picaresque novel. I hope you are familiar with these two terms. We are going to discuss the different genres or the different categories of novels in the next class when we will discuss Pride and Prejudice. But for today, I'll just tell that Bildungsroman means it's a story of the development of a character from innocence to experience, from fault to knowledge. So it's a character making story. Okay, we'll talk about Bildungsroman in the next class, and picaresque fiction, what's that? So when in 1749 it was published, Tom Jones was published, it was one of the earliest English works to be classified as a novel. And in the narrative technique, the most important feature is the highly visible narrator. The highly visible narrator, because we find the narrator in the first chapter of every part, the 16 books, and the first chapter is by the narrator. The narrator directly addresses. Each book begins with a prefatory chapter directly addressing the reader, and the narrator provides a continuous commentary on characters and events. So we find the continuous presence of the narrator in Tom Jones. It's like a subplot. Ryan Booth says that the reader's relationship with the narrator is something like a subplot in the story. And Fielding presents a panorama of contemporary British life, drawing characters from many different classes and occupations. And Ian Watt in Rise of the Novel says that Fielding did not aim at the realism of presentation. Rather, he focused on realism of assessment. And it was a wise assessment of life. Let's discuss the significance of the introductory chapters. Think of those introductory essays given in the beginning of each book in Tom Jones. And there are 18 books in the novel. Means 18 essays, sorry, I told 16, it's 18. The titles of some of the essays are like this. Of the serious in writing and for what purpose it is introduced. Then one of the chapter is of love, or of those who lawfully may, or of those who may not write such histories as this, or a farewell to the reader. These are the kinds of, these are the titles of the chapters, the introductory chapters. So it seems that Fielding has chosen these topics at random and that he wants to share his ideas directly with the readers. It also gives us the impression that Fielding does not consider it necessary to relate these ideas in a direct sort of way to the evolving action of the novel. The prefatory, these introductory chapters are not directly related to the action of the story or the novel. For him, for Fielding, it does not matter whether those ideas have a bearing on the novel or not. So the novel is highly organized, despite its length. Though it's a very lengthy novel, it is highly organized. And Coleridge, the poet, has argued that it has one of the 3 most perfect plots ever planned. Do you know the difference between plot and story? What is that plot? Often people get a question, what is plot? How it is different from story? A story is a simple narration. Whereas when we speak of plot in a novel or a drama, we speak of the beginning, the exposition, then the initial incident, then we speak of rising action. In a plot, there is action, rising action, then we reach the climax. Then after the climax, there will be falling action, and the last will be resolution or the denouement. You must read because if you have drama, Shakespearean drama as a paper, you must read Aristotle's Poetics. That is very, very important to understand the concept of plot, the 3 unities. Okay, this is not related to this particular book. Still, I wanted to tell because you are a student of PG. Okay. So Aristotle Poetics is a very short book of 60-70 pages, and nowadays you can find any book on the net, any book on the internet. You need not order books, and you need not wait for the IGNOU material to come to you. You can go to the internet and find it out from the beginning, from the day you take your admission. It is available on the net. So for any text, you first go to the get any good history of English literature from the internet. For example, Allen's. Get one history of English literature and get one glossary of English literary terms by M.H. Abrams. Both are available on the net, the books. So if one complains that they do not find material, it is not a valid thing to say. In the age of internet, you have access to information and you can get material on anything from the internet. But the problem is, as I told you earlier, that of choice. You should go only for scholarly material, authentic, good material. So when you search for Tom Jones, you write Henry Fielding's Tom Jones PDF and search it. The first thing you'll find on your Google search will be a book on Tom Jones. And you can read it on your phone. Everybody. So don't wait for materials to come to you. It's already there. It's away from you. just a click away from you. Then we were talking about, it is one of the most three most perfect plots ever planned. This Tom Jones, and Coleridge was of that view. Then we were talking about that Man of Hill episode. Okay, why is the Man of Hill episode integral to the novel? So the Man of Hill episode has been specifically at the center of controversy among most of the 20th century critics. On his side, Fielding has presented the episode as the old man's history or story. Fielding's purpose is to integrate his story to the story of Tom Jones. Okay. And the Man of the Hill story is the account of that person from his early years to old age. And it is fact-based. And that's what we mean by history. A story also signifies a fictional account. And there is a deep relation between history and story. Earlier, people believed that stories or novels are imaginary accounts. But now, with the rise of subaltern studies in the discipline of, it's an interdisciplinary study actually. The subaltern studies, they emphasize that history should not be the narrative of kings and the aristocrats. They believed in writing history from below. So now when you go through the books or the pages of history books, we don't find, in our times, it used to be the narratives of the kings and the aristocrats, of the ages and the dates and the names of the kings. Now when you turn the pages of NCERT book, you'll find the social, cultural events, the social background, the economic background, the fate of common people in history books. So it is writing history from below, the subaltern studies. And also there is a thin line between history and story. The notion that history is objective and literature is subjective has subsided. It is obsolete concept. History also rely on subjectivity, and in literature we find many things which are objective. Literature is also an account of the time. Okay. Then we were speaking about the Man of Hill episode. Both were travelers, Tom Jones and Pettis, both travelers, and with the Man of Hill, they encountered him on the way and they listened to his story. And he told his life and his experience, how he experienced a great deal of pain, that Man of Hill. And that is how the account of life of the Man of Hill is the story of an unhappy man. There's Tom and his companion here with uncommon interest. And it's a tale with a beginning when the Man of the Hill was a child. And it ends when he had a lapse of a whole active life. After that, he reached the conclusion that man alone, the king of the globe, the last and greatest work of the supreme being below the sun. He was optimist. And an important aspect of the personality of the Man of the Hill is that he has traveled a great deal during the life, from home to Oxford and from there to London and many small towns and villages. He went to the countries of Europe. He shares with Tom Jones this trait of moving around or traveling. In fact, there are more similarities between the character and this Man of the Hill and between Tom Jones. For instance, the Man of the Hill has an unloving mother and affectionate, well-meaning father. He has also a brother taking to evil eyes and becoming a strong adversary to the younger brother. The same case with Tom Jones. So if Tom listens intent to the history of the Man of Hill, it is largely an account of these and other similarities. So what I mean is that in this sense, the story of the old man becomes the history, or at least the part of Tom's history. So there you will find it in Unit 5. Unit 5, the importance of Man of Hill episode, the answer to that question you can find there. Then in Unit 6 of IGNOU material, we find the critical approaches. Okay. And the important thing is feminist concern in Fielding. The feminist concern in Fielding, it's also a question which came last year. So Fielding is one of the most pro-woman writers of English fiction. Isn't it amazing that this is substantially because he's not merely a keen observer of reality, also he recognizes and accepts people as they are. He's not judgmental about people. This means he does not wish to impose his views on them. For instance, if Fielding finds the women of his day indulging in sexual liberties recklessly, he would not go critically into the larger phenomenon that they should be sent to jail or they should be punished. He accepted people as they are. So Fielding's is most means the liberties that women took. It was same as like men. He did not judge them. Then you often get questions on marriage and female sexuality. So marriage, as Fielding says, is a social economic alliance between male and female. For example, the Bleefield brothers, they schemed their marriage with Brigadier Allworthy. They were not chosen by Allworthy, they schemed it. And the Captain Bleefield married Brigadier Allworthy for money. Or you can think of Tom Jones. His intimacy with Sophia would not get sanctioned because the marriage between two would not qualify on socio-economic ground, because earlier Tom was believed to be an illegitimate child. So Fielding has observed that the conduct code of marriage suppresses women's spontaneity more than that of men. The difference can be seen in the example of Squire Weston and his wife. And when, however, outside marriage, women behave freely to the extent of being aggressive. And in Tom Jones, we find they don't merely flirt, they actually seduce
Hello?
men and lead them to bed even.
Hello?
The females, hello?
May I ask a question?
Yes?
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Actually, why it is called the illegitimate? The child is called illegitimate. I mean, something doubt I have in that context. Will you please explain it again?
Yes, illegitimate means I don't want to use the word bastard here.
Okay.
Because that has a different
Yes, ma'am.
connotation
Actually,
and it seems rude.
yes, ma'am.
Legitimate
Actually,
means
why?
not of married couple. The child was not of a married couple.
Okay.
Before marriage, Brigadier Allworthy had Tom.
Yes, ma'am.
Before
Okay.
marriage, Brigadier Allworthy had a child, and it was Tom Jones. But she did not reveal to anyone that Tom was her child. So when Allworthy was on tour to London, when he came back, he found that a child was on his bed, was sleeping or lying on his bed. And he suspected that the child may belong to that Jenny Jones, and the teacher, maybe Patrice, maybe the father. It was just suspected. Later it came out in the story that the real mother of Tom Jones was the sister of Allworthy, Brigadier Allworthy. And that person, that lady, later married Bleefield, Captain Bleefield. And she had a son. She had a son, another son, Bleefield. So, towards the end of the story, we find that Tom was considered an illegitimate child, whose parentage was not known, while Bleefield was considered the son of Bleefield, Captain Bleefield and Brigadier Allworthy. Are you clear?
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, welcome. So we find that women in marriage had a different position altogether, but when they flirt, they actually seduce men and lead them to bed even. Thus, female sexuality and marriage stand in contrast to each other. We find that in Tom Jones. Then we find Tom's affinity with women. Tom's own sexuality is equally uninhibited, and it is pronounced. He had affairs with several women. We find it in the novel. His amorous adventure, which makes him, or many critics object to that. But Fielding says, or rather Fielding goes with the character, and we go by the intention, not by the art. We find that the person is virtuous because his heart was pure and he had good intentions. Then we also find the idea of poaching in the novel, the shooting of Patrice in the land of on the land of Squire Weston. It has both literal and metaphorical meaning. Tom never killed the birds, but he owned that he had killed And the crime, the person who did the crime was Black Judge, that servant, Modi's father. To save him from the punishment, Tom owned up the crime. But the idea of poaching or trespassing or intervening or encroaching on the territory of another person is exploited time and again by the author in the story. It signifies that the private space of an individual is always vulnerable to crime. For example, when the novel opens, the whole neighborhood is eager to know about the parentage of Tom. Okay, so Fielding's use the metaphor of poaching, P-O-A-C-H-I-N-G. It can be dealt in at three levels: economic, ideological, moral, and even in terms of gender. Then we find several motifs. Motifs means the scenes or the lines or certain figures or images which occurs at regular interval in a novel. Okay, M-O-T-I-F-S, motifs. Like food, travel, law, stage. Certain images they recur or they occur at regular interval in a story, and it gives unity to the story. We link it. Suppose in chapter 1 we find that food metaphor, it recurs after several chapters, we can link it and find the beauty of the story. So we'll know more about motifs in other classes because we have 8 classes in all. So then law, travel, all these are used as motifs in Tom Jones, and we also find certain images or certain things are used as symbols, like Sophia's moth, for example. So this is all about Tom Jones. I think we had a long lecture, and the rest of the class I should keep for discussion. Yeah, but before that, let me sum up very quickly. So Tom Jones, written by Henry Fielding, was published in 1749, and we discussed about the background of the period. For example, or say the 18th century, where we discussed that 18th century has been called the Augustan age, the neoclassical age, the age of enlightenment, and the age of enlightenment had keywords like region, rationality was much emphasized. Then the age witnessed the rise of middle class, who provided the readership to the novel. And also the class witnessed literary professionalism. Against such backdrop or background, writers like Fielding wrote. Then we talked about the 18th century novel, the rise of novel in 18th century, how the scientific temperament and emphasis on region led to stories of book, or how books and libraries prospered, and writing became both a profession and a trade. Then we talked about the forerunners of the novel form. Novel is a genre. Who are the forerunner, or what books are the forerunner? We discussed like Boccaccio's Decameron. We talked about Travels of John Mandeville, then Thomas Mallory's Mortuary Arthur, then Thomas More's Utopia, then Thomas Null's The Unfortunate Traveler, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, A Cervantes' Don Quixote. All these books are thought to be the forerunners of the novel as a genre. Then when we come to 18th century fiction, the major names that come to our mind are Defoe, Swift, Daniel Defoe with his Gulliver Travels, or Jonathan Swift, Defoe Robinson Crusoe, or we read Swift's Gulliver Travels, or Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa, or Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, Octavius Smollett, and we also read Stone. These are the major writers of novels in 18th century. Then when we talked about what led to the emergence and popularity of novel in 18th century in particular, there are two regions. The first is rise of middle class, and rise of middle class women in particular. A whole lot of them in the 18th century, they had the leisure to relax with a book or a periodical in their hand. And the second is the rise of periodical, and we know of Edison Steele and the periodicals like the Spectator, the Tattlers. These two are the major regions. And when we speak of Henry Fielding as a writer of novel, mostly he wrote his. We talk of those writings as comedy. They wrote in comic vein. We talked about Henry Fielding, his biography or as a writer, his other books. The other books are The Life of Mrs. Pamela Andrews, which is a parody of Richardson's Pamela. Then his first book, the work was followed by his first novel. The first novel of Fielding is Joseph Andrews, which was published in 1742. And it is also a parody. The central character was presented as Pamela's brother, Richardson's Pamela. Then Fielding's next work, it contained the life of Jonathan Wild the Great. Then the Tom Jones of Foundling, published in 1749, is the best comic novel ever written. Is considered the best, one of the best comic novels ever written. We read the story of. Then he has also books like Amelia, and his last book, The Journal of a Voyage to Lisbon. So Fielding as a writer, and then we came to the novel Tom Jones. We discussed the characters because, as I told you, that the novel has a lot of characters. The novel itself is a very long one and it has a lot of characters. First read the characters once, then you read the novel. And I repeat, the novel is available on the net. And during this lockdown time, you hardly need to go outside. So you can stay at home and read the entire novel. You can finish it in 3-4 days. Then we read the summary of, we discussed the summary of Tom Jones, which we can divide comfortably into 3 categories. It is set in Somersetshire, where Allworthy is there, how Tom Jones was found, then till he grows up, loves Sophia and all the events, then Tom on the road and the different affairs at the inn and different misunderstandings, then Tom in London, how the misunderstandings are cleared in the end, and Tom and Sophia are happily married. Then we discuss the questions of the previous years. And when we analyze the questions of the previous years, we found that in novel, mostly we expect questions in the exam on themes, characters, and narrative techniques. So you need to write your notes on themes, characters, and narrative techniques. And we dealt with certain important things while discussing themes, characters, and narrative techniques. For example, in the context of themes, virtue as action rather than thought, we discussed that. We also talked about, when we talked about characters, we talked about typical and individual characters. And there was a question on that. Then you need to discuss the Tom Jones, the protagonist, or the heroine, the female protagonist, Sophia Weston, the minor characters, the female characters. When we speak of the narrative techniques, those prefatory chapters in each book are really important. You need to read those introductory chapters and their significance. Then we discuss why the Man of Hill episode is integral to the novel. And it's a part of Unit 5 of your IGNOU material. You can find a detailed account of it in that book. Then Unit 6 is about the critical approaches to, or the modern critical approaches to Tom Jones, where the feminist concern in Fielding's have been addressed. So all these, it's a brief summary of the whole thing. I hope you learned something. Yes. It's open for you now to question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Did you get an idea of the whole thing? We discussed the summary. At the same time, we discussed how to approach our text. Okay. Your questions, please.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
The plot and theme of the novel are the same thing or something different?
Something different. Okay. When we speak of themes, we speak of the subjects. What are the subjects, the issues that or the problems or the issues that the story deals with? or the novel deals with. For example, here virtue versus vice, okay. Virtue versus vice, or many other social economic theme, religious theme, moral themes. Those are themes, the subjects of the story. But when we speak of plot, it is the structure. It's the structure, the beginning, then the rising action. Then it all reaches the climax when there is misunderstanding and a lot of complications in the story. Okay. It reaches the climax, the plot. Then we find falling action. Gradually, everything is resolved. Okay. And finally, we reach the resolution or the denouement. That is plot, the structure. Theme is something different.
Okay,
I
ma'am.
hope you understood.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
And anything else? So today we discussed block 1 of MEG 3. Okay. MEG 3, block 1. Okay. I again request you all to read Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. Download the book from the internet and go through the book. Read the book. Okay. But because we are going to have regular classes, and every day we will have a class, at the moment you can manage with the summary. Later you can read the whole book. Okay. First read the book, then read the IGNOU material. That is the best material provided to you. You can use it for your exams. And when you see the in the beginning of each means unit, suppose block 1, unit 1, in the beginning you find the objective and some keywords, and those are the questions. Mostly you get questions from those. For example, these characters, typical and individual character, it is there in the book. Or the marriage in Tom Jones or in Fielding. Whatever you get, or whatever questions you get only from those books. Okay. So go through it.
Hello, ma'am.
Okay, yes, hello.
Ma'am, Henry Fielding is considered as the founder of the English novel or as the father of English novel, is it?
No, not actually founder of English novel. That's why I told you the predecessors of this novel form. It is not evolved in a day. Okay. That's why we talk of Boccaccio's Decameron and those Cervantes, Don Quisto, and so many books. Okay. But often Fielding is called the father of English novel by many critics. Okay. Because he developed a plot and he, as an organized prose form, okay, prose story, he wrote novels. But when we go to Defoe's book, Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver Travels, those are novels too. So there is a controversy. Yes, critics don't agree on this actually.
And ma'am, about Samuel Richardson?
Samuel Richardson. Okay. See, when we read history of English literature, we talk of the four wheels of novel then. Okay. Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, and Stone. So they carried it. They together carried it forward.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Good evening, ma'am. This is Sharmishta here. I have one question, ma'am.
Yes, sure, please.
Yes, ma'am. As because I am specifically talking about myself, so as because I'm doing my distance learning and I'm working right now, I would like to know, being a teacher, I know that there are certain criteria under which certain answers are marked. So for drama, I request you to tell us about, throw light on this, these facts. What are the examiners looking at actually when they are examining our paper? What is it?
You see, I have never examined the IGNOU papers, but when we examine the PG papers, normally in universities, the English teachers are very particular about two things. I'm not going into the themes and the writings and all this. The English teachers are very particular about two things. One is correct grammar. There should not be any grammatical mistakes when you are writing your papers for PG in English, your writing should not have any grammatical mistake. And the second thing is language, vocabulary.
Yes, ma'am.
Good vocabulary always attracts. The rich vocabulary, if you have rich vocabulary, you should not repeat words. The language should have an ease of flow.
Yes.
And also, you should not write the story. While writing the answer, one should not write a story. One should be able to critically appreciate it, analyze it. That critical appreciation part should be there. Okay. And when you are reading a particular novel or any drama from a particular author of a particular period, so it's better if you read other books. For example, when you are reading Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, you should have knowledge also of at least you should know the story of Joseph Andrews or Samila or something with which you can compare Tom Jones.
You're talking about cross-reference, ma'am?
Yes, beg your pardon.
Are you talking? Are you? I beg your pardon. Are you talking about cross-reference, ma'am?
Yes, you must quote or you must compare the text of similar nature. Because the students of literature are not confined to the text prescribed. You must go beyond the text and read text of similar nature. When you have been prescribed, so suppose when we are discussing E.M. Forster, A Passage to India, the experience of English people in India. There are several other novels with the same theme. How the Empire Writes Back. We have to use, at PG level, we have to use certain theories also, if you are familiar with that.
Okay.
So
we have to basically do a research on ourselves, or are these books labeled there in our study material?
In your study material, it's based on research. That's the best study material you have got. It is based on research. You find a reference to number of critics and other people. You go through it. First you read the novel, then you read it. You find that your study material is just excellent.
Okay, ma'am. Thanks a lot, ma'am. Your class was excellent and very, very nice. It was really a pleasure to be a part of this group.
Thank you so much. Welcome. Shall we start now?
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, on that note, I have a question.
Sure.
Regarding the questions, in the examination, we'll be having 20 marks questions, right?
Yes, yes.
So, how long should it generally be, or how much should be the word length?
See, you have raised a very important question actually, because you have 100 marks and you have 5 questions. You have 3 hours. You have to keep in mind that normally students, they start with the first questions, they write it well, but they take a lot of time in writing the first question. They take around 1 hour in writing the first question. You have to plan it all before the exam. Means I will write a particular question for 35 minutes only. In that way, you will be able to do justice to all the questions. Okay. So you have to see your watch, and the moment you have crossed 30 minutes, you should wind up that question, or come to the conclusion part of the question. So it's always better to practice, to make notes of everything and read it. You make notes on possible questions, expected questions. Even you can mark portions on your IGNOU materials, the important things, and you develop a kind of note. Read it several times before sitting on the exams. Because if you think that at the time of the exam you will think and write, then you will not be able to manage time. Because last year a student called me and told that he has been able to answer only 3 questions. And will he be able to get 60 marks? No, a clear no. So you have to do justice to all the questions and answer every question equally. Means give full time to every question. It's not that 4 questions will be written in a good length, will have good length, and the last 2 answers will be too short. You can't do that.
Okay, ma'am, and the previous questions, they're all available on the website?
Yes, it's all available on the net. You just type MEG3 previous year questions. The first, you'll get it of
Okay, ma'am.
8, 9 years. You'll
Okay,
get
ma'am.
it.
Thank
And
you.
everything is available on the net. Okay? Don't wait for the material to come to you. It is all available on the net.
Thank you, ma'am.
Well,
Ma'am, one more
shall we
question.
start now?
Shamishta here again. Ma'am, one more question I wanted to ask. Which is the next unit? Are you going to do unit 2 tomorrow?
Yes, we are going to do unit 2 tomorrow, block 2, I mean,
Yeah,
Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Okay?
Yes, ma'am.
A
Thank
very
you.
classic novel. Let's wait to talk about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
Yes,
Meet you
ma'am.
tomorrow then?
Yes, ma'am. We will be
Okay.
prepared.
Okay. Read the story before coming for the class. We'll meet
Yes,
at the
ma'am.
same time for tomorrow. Okay,
Hello.
bye.
Hello.
Okay, shall
Hello.
yes?
Sorry, ma'am.
Anybody else?
Excuse me. Okay. Sorry, ma'am.
Hmm?
One question. Then in the
Hmm?
question word limit, I want to know the word limit for the question. Just
Okay, we'll talk about it tomorrow.
okay,
We'll
ma'am.
talk
Okay, it's
about it.
okay.
Okay, don't worry.
Have a
Don't
okay, ma'am.
worry.
Nice class.
We'll talk. We have 8 classes, so we'll talk about all these. Don't worry. Okay,
Okay, ma'am.
let's talk
Thank you.
today then.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Bye.